Although, or perhaps because he was born in England, Thomas Cole, the most prominent member of the Hudson River School of Landscape Painting, best defined those qualities that distinguish American landscapes from European ones. In his essay on American scenery, published in January 1836 issue of American Monthly Magazine, Cole described the unique nature of the American countryside. There are those whose ignorance or prejudice strives to maintain that the American scenery possesses little that is interesting or truly beautiful, that being destitute of those vestiges of antiquity whose associations so strongly affect the mind, it may not be compared with European scenery. I am by no means desirous of lessening in your estimation the glorious scenes of the Old World, over which time and genius have suspended an imperishable halo. No, but I would have it remembered that nature has shed over this land beauty and magnificence, and although the character of its scenery may differ from the old world's, yet inferiority must not therefore be inferred, for though American scenery is destitute of many of those circumstances that give value to European, still it has features and glorious ones unknown to Europe. The most distinctive and perhaps the most impressive characteristic of American scenery is its wildness. It is the most distinctive because in civilized Europe the primitive features of scenery have long since been destroyed or modified. In America, nature is still predominant. Those scenes of solitude from which the hand of nature has never been lifted affect the mind with a more deep-toned emotion than aught which the hand of man has touched. Amid them the consequent associations are of God the Creator, they are his undefiled works, and the mind is cast into the contemplation of eternal things. Cole's masterpiece is the Oxbow, view from Holyoke, Northampton, Massachusetts, after a thunderstorm, in which he inserted his self-portrait. He is the tiny figure working at his easel at the bottom center of the canvas. He has paused in his work to turn his head to the viewer. Cole's presence certifies, as does the painting's title, that this landscape is not imaginary but a specific place seen and recorded by the painter. The viewer does not notice the artist at first, only the vast panorama of western Massachusetts, where the Connecticut River forms an oxbow-shaped turning. Cole divided the composition in two, with the undeveloped wildness on the left and the cultivated fields and small settlements on the right, a specifically American landscape. Albert Bierstadt. Other Hudson River artists used the landscape genre as an allegorical vehicle to address moral and spiritual concerns. Albert Bierstadt traveled west in 1858 and produced many paintings depicting the Rocky Mountains, Yosemite Valley, and other dramatic locales. These works, such as among the Sierra Nevada Mountains, California, present breathtaking scenery and natural beauty. This panoramic view, which is 10 feet wide, is awe-inspiring. Deer and waterfowl appear at the edge of a placid lake, and steep and rugged mountains soar skyward on the left and in the distance. A stand of trees, uncultivated and wild, frames the lake on the right. To underscore the transcendental nature of the scene, Bierstadt depicted the sun's rays breaking through the clouds overhead, suggesting a heavenly consecration of the land. Frederick Church. Another painter usually associated with the Hudson River School was Frederick Edwin Church, but his interest in landscape scenes extended beyond America. He traveled widely to South America, Mexico, Europe, the Middle East, Newfoundland, and Labrador. Church's paintings are firmly in the idiom of the romantic sublime, yet they also reveal contradictions and conflicts in the constructed mythology of American providence and character. Twilight in the Wilderness presents a panoramic view of the sun setting over the majestic landscape. Beyond Church's precise depiction of the magnificent spectacle of nature, the painting, like Constable's Haywain, is remarkable for what it does not depict. Like Constable, Church, and the other Hudson River School painters worked in a time of great upheaval. Twilight in the Wilderness dates to the 1860s when the Civil War was tearing apart the no longer United States. Church's painting does not overtly display evidence of turbulence or discord. Indeed, it does not even include a single figure. But the view of nature that Church provides is not entirely comforting. Besides the rich vegetation and glorious sunset, there are also dead trees, perhaps symbolizing the casualties of the Civil War, if we infer symbolism. Gustave Courbet, The Stonebreakers, an early work that exemplifies Courbet's champion of everyday life as the only valid subject for the modern artist, is The Stonebreakers, in which the realist painter presented a glimpse into the life of rural menial laborers. Courbet represented in a straightforward manner and nearly at life size two men, one about 70, the other quite young, in the decidedly non-heroic act of breaking stones to provide paving for provincial roads. Traditionally, this back-breaking, poorly paid work fell to the lowest members of French society, as the stonebreakers' tattered garments and utensils for modern meal of soup confirm. By juxtaposing youth and age, Courbet suggested that those born to poverty will remain poor their entire lives. The artist neither romanticized nor idealized the men's work, but depicted their thanklessness and toil with directness and accuracy. Courbet's palette of dirty browns and grays further conveys the dreary and dismal nature of the task, and the angular positioning of the old stonebreaker's limbs suggests a mechanical monotony. Courbet's interest in the working poor as a subject matter had a special resonance for his mid-19th century French audience. In 1848, laborers rebelled against the bourgeois leaders of the newly formed Second Republic and against the rest of the nation, demanding better working conditions and a redistribution of property. The army quelled the uprising in 3 days, but not without long-lasting trauma and significant loss of life. The 1848 revolution raised the issue of labor as a national concern. Courbet's depiction of stonebreakers in 1849 was thus timely, populist, and socialistic. Burial at Ornans. Many art historians regard Courbet's Burial at Ornans as his masterpiece. This huge 10 by 22-foot canvas depicts a funeral set in a bleak provincial landscape outside the artist's hometown near Besançon in eastern France. Attending the funeral are types of ordinary people that Honore de Balzac and Gustave Flaubert presented in their novels, while a robed clergyman recites the Office of the Dead. Those attending cluster around the excavated gravesite. Although the painting has the imposing scale of a traditional historic painting, the subject's ordinariness and the starkly anti-heroic composition horrified critics. Burial at Ornans is not a record of the burial of a Christian martyr or a heroic soldier. It commemorates a recurring event involving common folk, and it does not ennoble or romanticize death. No one had ever painted a genre subject on this scale. Furthermore, Courbet had the audacity to submit Burial at Ornans to the 1851 Salon in the category of history painting, but declined to identify the deceased. Arranged in a wavering line, extending across the enormous breadth of the canvas, are three groups. The somberly clad women at the back, right, a semicircle of similarly clad men, including town officials and a hunting dog by the open grave, and an assorted churchman at the left. The seemingly equal stature of all of the funeral also offended the hierarchical social sensibility of the salon audience. This wall of figures blocks any view into deep space. The faces are portraits, Some of the models were Courbet's fathers, sisters, and friends. Behind and above the figures are bands of overcast sky and barren cliffs. The dark pit of the grave opens into the viewer's space in the center foreground. Despite the unposed look of the figures, Courbet controlled the composition in a masterful way by his sparing use of bright color. In place of the heroic, the sublime, and the dramatic, the mourners are all emotionally detached. Courbet aggressively presented salon viewers with mundane realities. In 1857, Jules François Félix Husson Champfleury, one of the first critics to recognize and appreciate Courbet's work, wrote of Burial at Ornans. It represented a small-town funeral and yet reproduces the funerals of all small towns. Unlike the theatricality of Romanticism, Realism captured the ordinary rhythms of daily life. Of great importance for the later history of art, Realism also involved a reconsideration of the painter's primary goals and departed from the established emphasis on illusionism. Accordingly, realists called attention to painting as a pictorial construction by the ways they applied pigment or manipulated composition. Courbet's intentionally simple methods of expression in composition and technique seemed unbearably crude to many of his more conservative contemporaries. Although his somber palette was essentially traditional, Courbet often used the palette knife to quickly place and unify large daubs of paint, producing a roughly wrought surface. He referred to his painting technique as naive, that is, direct as opposed to polished, contrived manner of academic painters. Courbet's example inspired young artists who worked for him, and later impressionists such as Claude Monet and Auguste Renoir, discussed in the next chapter. But the public accused him of carelessness, and critics wrote of his brutalities. Jean-François Millet. Like Courbet, Jean-François Millet found his subjects in the people and occupations of everyday world. Millet was one of a group of French painters of country life who, to be close to their rural subjects, settled near the village of Barbizon in the forest of Fontainebleau. This Barbizon school specialized in detailed pictures of forest and countryside. Millet, their most prominent member, was born in a prosperous farming family in Normandy, but was keenly aware of the hard lot of the country poor. In The Gleaners, he depicted three impoverished women, members of the lowest level of peasant society, performing the back-breaking task of gleaning. Wealthy landowners traditionally permitted peasants to glean or collect the wheat scraps left in the field after the harvest. Millet characteristically placed his large figures in the foreground against a broad sky. Although the field stretches back to a rim of haystacks, cottages, trees, and distant workers, and a flat horizon, the gleaners quietly doing their tedious and time-consuming work dominates the canvas. It is hard to imagine a sharper contrast with the almost invisible agricultural workers in Constable's hay wain. The French public reacted to Millet with the same disdain and suspicion with which it greeted Courbet. In the aftermath of the 1848 Revolution, Millet's investiture of the poor with solemn grandeur did not meet with approval from the newly prosperous middle class. In particular, these new landowners resisted granting gleaning rights, and thus Millet's relatively dignified depiction of gleaning antagonized them. The middle class also linked the poor with the growing and increasingly assertive working class, which was finding outspoken champions in men such as Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and the novelists Émile Zola and Charles Dickens. Courbet was an ardent follower of Marx, and socialism was a growing movement. Both its views on property and its calls for social justice, even economic equality, threatened and frightened the bourgeoisie. Millet's sympathetic portrayal of the poor seemed to much of the public to be a political manifesto. Daumier's lithograph, Rue Tronçonneau, published in the August 1834 issues of L'Association Mensuelle, a monthly French newspaper, is one of the greatest and politically most explosive works. The title refers to a day when, on that street in Paris, an unknown sniper killed a civil guard, part part of a government force trying to repress a worker demonstration. Because the fatal shot had come from a workers' housing block, the remaining guards immediately stormed the building and massacred all of its inhabitants. The lithograph had the same shocking impact as Goya's 3rd of May 1808. But in Rue Tronçonneau, Daumier depicted not the dramatic moment of execution, but the terrible, quiet aftermath, the limp bodies of the workers and of a child crushed beneath his father's corpse lie amid violent disorder. The print's power derives from its factualness. Daumier's pictorial manner is rough and spontaneous, and that approach to representation which is central characteristic of realistic art accounts in large measure for Rue Tronçonneau's remarkable force and impact. Rosa Bonheur. The most celebrated woman artist of the 19th century was Marie Rosalie Bonheur. Born in Bordeaux, she won the gold medal at the Salon in 1848 and became the director of France's state-sponsored drawing school for women the same year, a post she held until 1859. In 1865, Bonheur became the first woman to be awarded the Grand Cross of the French Legion of Honor for the Arts. As was typical for women since the Renaissance, Bonheur received her artistic training from her father, Oscar Raymond Bonheur, who was a proponent of Saint-Simonism, an early 19th century utopian socialist movement that championed the education and enfranchisement of women. As a result of her father's influence, Bonheur launched her career believing that as a woman, an artist, and a lesbian who frequently wore male attire, she had a special role to play in creating a new and perfect society. A realist passion for accuracy in painting drove Bonheur, but she resisted depicting the problematic social and political themes seen in the work of Courbet, Millet, Daumier, and other realists. Rather, she turned to the animal world, not, however, to the exotic wild animals that so fascinated Delacroix, but to animals common in the French countryside, especially horses, but also rabbits, cows, and sheep. She went to great lengths to observe the anatomy of living horses at the twice-weekly Parisian horse market, and spent long hours studying the anatomy of carcasses in the Paris slaughterhouses. Women were not permitted in French stockyards and slaughterhouses, but Bonheur's male garb gained her access. For the horse fair, Bonheur's best-known work, the artist chose a panoramic composition similar to that in Courbet's Burial at Onran. She filled her broad canvas with the sturdy farm percherons of Normandy and their grooms on parade. Some horses, not quite broken, rear up. Others plod or trot, guided on foot or ridden by their keepers. Bonheur recorded the Percherons' uneven line of march, thus their thunderous pounding, and their seemingly overwhelming power based on her close observation of living animals. Even though she acknowledged some inspiration from the Parthenon frieze, the dramatic lighting, loose brushwork, and rolling sky also reveal her admiration of Géricault's style. Bonheur's masterful depiction of horses at life size and seen from multiple angles captivated viewers, who eagerly bought engraved reproductions of the horse fair, making it one of the most popular artworks of the century. When his friend Charles Garnier asked him in 1867 to carve one of the four gigantic reliefs for the ground floor piers of the facade of the new Opera in Paris, in the spirit of the Arc de Triomphe, Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux, a pupil of Francois Rude, who provided one of the colossal reliefs for the Parisian arch, eagerly accepted. The commission for each relief called for a single allegorical figure of one of the arts performed at the Opera House, with that figure surrounded by subsidiary figures. Carpeau's assigned subject was dancing. His visualization of that theme in the dance clearly reveals his debt to the Greco-Roman and Italian Baroque sculpture. The personification of dancing is a leaping, winged, nude youth with his arms raised joyfully in the air and holding a tambourine in his right hand. Forming a swinging circle around him are several smiling and laughing, nude or scantily clad young women, a puto and a satyr, a veritable bacchanal. Carpeaux unveiled the 14-foot-high relief on July 27, 1869. The public reacted with shock, deeming the work scandalous because of its depiction of drunkenness and unbridled sexuality, and because of Carpeau's realistic representation of human anatomy. Although all the figures are young and attractive, they are not idealized classical nudes. They have creases in their fleshy torsos and hips, and their bony ankles and elbows and kneecaps pressed through their flesh. In short, Carpeau's nudes are in the tradition not of Antonio Canova, but of Edouard Manet, whose paintings also unleashed a critical uproar. Moreover, the orgiastic reveling of Carpeau's lusty dancers bore no resemblance to the conservative classical ballet performed on the opera's stage. One protester flung a bottle of ink at Carpeau's relief. The outrage at the realism and perceived immorality of the dance forced Garnier to remove Carpeau's group from the opera facade, but a copy was eventually installed after Carpeau's death. The original is in the Musée d'Orsay. Edouard Manet. Younger than both Courbet and Carpeaux, the painter Edouard Manet was also influential in articulating realist principles. However, unlike his older contemporaries in France, Manet often portrayed daily life in industrialized Paris. In his choice of subjects, as well as his style and technique, Manet played an important role in the development of Impressionism in the 1870s. Manet's Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, Luncheon on the Grass, widely recognized only later as a seminal work in the history of art, was rejected by the jury for the 1863 Salon. Nevertheless, the public was able to view and mock the painting as a special exhibition for rejected works, the Salon des Refusés. The Déjeuner depicts two clothed men and one naked and one clothed woman at a picnic. Consistent with realist principle, Manet painted a contemporary genre scene and based all four figures on real people, including his brother and Victorine Marinet, Manet's favorite model at the time. The two men wear fashionable Parisian attire of the 1860s. The naked woman she has undressed in the park and tossed her clothes on the grass is a distressingly unidealized figure who also seems completely unfazed by her nakedness. She gazes directly at the viewer without shame or flirtatiousness. Her companion looks in the same direction. Neither pays any attention to what the second man is saying to them, nor is it clear what relationship, if any, the second woman has to the trio at lunch. She appears to be looking for something in a pool of water while attempting unsuccessfully to keep her garment dry. No one has any interest in the picnic food. This is no luncheon on the grass, although it may be the aftermath of a meal, nor is this truly realism because the subject is incomprehensible, as Manet wished it to be. In this work, he sought to reassess the nature of painting. The composition contains sophisticated references and allusions to many artistic genres: history painting, portraiture, pastoral scenes, nudes. Le Déjeuner is Manet's impressive critique of European painting since the Renaissance. This audacious painting outraged the French public. Rather than a traditional pastoral scene, for example, Titian's Pastoral Symphony, with which Manet was familiar and no doubt wished his canvas to be compared, Le Déjeuner is not populated by anonymous idealized figures in an idealized setting. Instead, it features ordinary men and what the public regarded as promiscuous women in a Parisian park. As Manet's images frequently do, calls attention to the visible and unsettling for many collapse of a class-based society in the wake of the 1848 revolution. One hostile critic, no doubt voicing public opinion, said, "A commonplace woman of the demi-monde, as naked as can be shamelessly, lolls between two dandies dressed to the teeth. These latter look like schoolboys on a holiday, perpetrating an outrage to play the man. This is a young man's practical joke, a shameful open sore." The negative response to Manet's painting on the part of the public and critics alike extended beyond subject matter. The painter's manner of presenting his figures also elicited severe criticism. He rendered the men and women in soft focus and broadly painted the landscape. The loose manner of painting contrasts with the clear forms of the harshly lit foreground trio of the pile of discarded clothes and picnic foods at the lower left. The lighting creates strong contrast between dark and highlighted areas. In the main figures, many values are summed up in one or two lights or darks. The effect is both to flatten in the forms and set them off sharply from the setting. Manet aimed to move away from illusionism towards an open acknowledgement of painting's properties, such as the flatness of the painting surface, which would become a core principle of many later 19th century painters as well as their successors to the present day. The mid-19th century French public, however, saw only a crude sketch, lacking the customary finish of paintings exhibited in the Paris Salon. The style of painting, coupled with its unorthodox subject matter, made Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe one of the most controversial artworks ever created. Olympia. Even more scandalous to the French viewing public, however, was Manet's Olympia, painted the same year and also loosely based on a painting by Titian, The Venus of Urbino. Manet's painting was a young white prostitute. Olympia was a common professional name for a prostitute in the 19th century in Paris. She reclines on a bed that extends across the full width of the painting and beyond, and is naked except for a thin black ribbon tied around her neck, a bracelet on her arm, and an orchid in her hair, and fashionable slippers on her feet. Like the seated woman in Le Déjeuner, Olympia, Victorine Maronet served as Manet's model, meets the viewer's eye and her presumed male client's gaze with a look of cool confidence. The only other figure in the painting is a black maid who represents Olympia with a bouquet of flowers from the man who has just entered her bedroom. Olympia horrified everyone who saw it at the Salon of 1865. Surprisingly, the jury accepted the painting for inclusion. One reviewer described Manet as the apostle of the ugly and repulsive. Although images of prostitutes were not unheard of during the period, the shamelessness of Olympia and her look verging on defiance shocked viewers. The depiction of the black woman was also not new to painting, but the French public perceived Manet's inclusion of both a black maid and a naked prostitute as evoking moral depravity. The contrast of the black servant with the fair-skinned courtesan also conjured racial divisions. An anonymous critic in Le Monde Illustre described Olympia as a courtesan with dirty hands and wrinkled feet. Her body has the livid tint of a cadaver displayed in the morgue. Her outlines are drawn in charcoal, and her greenish bloodshot eyes appear to be provoking the public, protected all the while by a hidden negress. From this and similar reviews, it is clear that critics and the public were responding not solely to the subject matter, but to Manet's painting technique as well. The painter's brushstrokes are much rougher, and the shifts in tonality far more abrupt than those found in traditional academic painting. This departure from accepted practice compounded the audacity of the subject matter. Olympia, indeed, all of Manet's work, represented a radical departure from the academic style then in favor and exemplified by the work of Adolphe William Bouguereau, an artist largely ignored in histories of art today, although he was a towering figure of the French artwork during the second half of the 19th century. Bouguereau, Nymphs and a Satyr. To understand better the public reaction to Manet's radically new painting style, it is instructive to compare Olympia to a work by the highly acclaimed French academic artist of the time, Adolphe William Bouguereau. In Nymphs and a Satyr, Bouguereau characteristically depicted a classical mythological subject with polished illusionism. The flirtatious and ideally beautiful nymphs strike gracefully poses as they playfully pull in different directions the satyr, the mythological Greek beast man with goat's hindquarters and horns, a horse's ears and a tail, and a man's upper body. The mood as well as the subject recalls the Rococo sculptures of Clodion. Although Bouguereau arguably depicted the scene in a very naturalistic manner, it is emphatically not realist. His choice of a fictional theme and adherence to established painting conventions were staunchly traditional. In contrast to the daring and pioneering and underappreciated Bouguereau was immensely popular during the later 19th century, enjoying the favor of state patronage throughout his career. Winslow Homer. Realism received an especially warm welcome in the United States. One of the leading American realist painters was Winslow Homer of Boston. Homer experienced at first hand the most momentous event of his era, the Civil War. In October 1862, he joined the Union campaign as an artist reporter for Harper's Weekly. At the end of the war, he painted Veteran in a New Field. Although it is simple and direct, Homer's painting is a significant commentary on the effects and aftermath of America's catastrophic national conflict. At the center of the canvas is a man with his back to the viewer, harvesting wheat. Homer identified him as a veteran by including his uniform and canteen carelessly thrown on the ground in the lower right corner. The man's current occupation, however, is as a farmer, and he has cast aside his former role as a soldier, as did the veterans of America's Revolutionary War in the previous century. The Civil War's veteran involvement in meaningful and productive work implies a smooth transition from war to peace. This post-war transition to work and the fate of a disbanded soldier were national concerns, echoing the sentiments behind Houdon's portrayal of George Washington as the new Cincinnatus. The New York Weekly Tribune commented, "Rome took her great man from the plow and made him a dictator. We must now take our soldiers from the camp and make them farmers." America's ability to effect a smooth transition was seen as evidence of its national strength. The peaceful and harmonious disbanding of the armies in the summer of 1865, wrote poet Walt Whitman, was one of the most immortal proofs of democracy unequaled in the history of the past. Homer's painting thus reinforced the perception of the country's greatness. Veteran in A New Field also comments symbolically about death. By the 1860s, farmers used cradled scythes to harvest wheat. For this detail, however, Homer rejected realism in favor of symbolism. The former soldier's tool is a single-bladed scythe. The artist thus transformed the man who lived through the Civil War into a symbol of death, the Grim Reaper himself. In addition to being a tribute to the successful transition to peace, Veteran in a New Field is an elegy to the thousands of soldiers who did not return from the war. Thomas Eakins. Even more determined a realist than Homer was Philadelphia-born Thomas Eakins, whose paintings reflected his keen appetite for recording the realities of the human experience. Eakins studied both painting and medical anatomy in Philadelphia before undertaking further study under French artist Jean-Léon Gérôme. Eakins aimed to paint things as he saw them, rather than as the public might wish them to be portrayed. This attitude was very much in tune with the 19th century American taste, combining an admiration for accurate depiction with a hunger for truth. The true brutal realism of Eakins' early masterpiece, The Gross Clinic, perhaps inspired by Rembrandt's anatomy lesson of Dr. Nicholas Tulp, prompted the art jury to reject it for the Philadelphia exhibition celebrating the American Independence Centennial in 1876. The painting portrays the renowned surgeon Dr. Samuel Gross in the operating amphitheater of the Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, where the painting hung for 130 years until its sale in 2006 to raise funds for the college. Eakins' decisions to depict an operation in progress reflects the public's increasing faith that scientific and medical advances could enhance and preserve lives. Dr. Gross, with bloody fingers and scalpel, lectures about his surgery on a young man's leg. The patient suffered from osteomyelitis, a bone infection. Watching the surgeon, acclaimed for his skill in this specific operation, and several colleagues, all of whom historians have identified, and the patient's mother, who covers her face, Eakins, who considered becoming a physician and studied at the college, included his self-portrait in the doorway at the right to underscore the accuracy of what he recorded as an eyewitness. Also presented is an anesthetist who holds a cloth over the patient's face. Anesthetics had been introduced in 1846, and their development eliminated a major obstacle to extensive surgery. The painting, made more dramatic by the lighting, is an unsparing description of an unfolding event, with a good deal more reality than many viewers could endure. It is a picture, one critic said, that even strong men find difficult to look at for long, if they can look at it at all. Consistent with the dominance of empiricism in the later half of the 19th century, Eakins believed that careful observation and, where relevant, scientific knowledge were prerequisites for his art, and he created his paintings in a deliberate methodological way based on first-hand study of his subject. For example, Eakins' focuses on anatomical correctness led him to investigate the human form and humans in motion, both with regular photographic apparatuses and with a special camera devised by the French kinesiologist, a person who studies the physiology of body movement. Etienne Jules Murray. Eakins later collaborated with Edward Muybridge in the photographic study of animal and human action of all types, anticipated in the 20th century invention of the motion picture. John Singer Sargent. The expatriate American artist John Singer Sargent, born in Florence, Italy, was a younger contemporary of Eakins. Sargent developed a looser, more dashing, realist painting style. In contrast to Eakin's carefully rendered details, Sargent studied art in Paris before settling in London, where he won renown both as a cultivated and cosmopolitan gentleman and as an accomplished portrait painter. He learned his adept application of paint in thin layers and his effortless achievement of quick and lively illusion from his study of Velázquez, whose masterpiece Las Meninas may have influenced Sargent's family portrait, The Daughters of Edward Darley Bois. The four girls, the children of one of Sargent's close friends, appears in a hall and small dining room in their Paris home. The informal, eccentric arrangement of their slight figures suggests how much at ease they are within the familiar space, and with objects such as the enormous Japanese vases, the red screen, and the fringed rug, whose scale subtly emphasizes the children's small stature. Sargent must have known the Bois daughters well. Relaxed and trustful, they gave the artist an opportunity to record the girls' distinct personalities. The naive, wondering openness of the youngest daughter in the foreground, the grave artlessness of the 10-year-old child, and the slightly self-conscious poise of the two adolescents. Sargent's casual positioning of the figures and seemingly random choice of the setting communicate a sense of spontaneity. The children seem to be attending momentarily to an adult who had asked them to interrupt their activity. The painting embodies the realist belief that the artist's business is to record modern people in modern contexts. Henry Ossawa Tanner. Realist painter Henry Ossawa Tanner studied art with Eakins at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts before moving to Paris in 1891. There he combined Eakins' belief in an early study for nature with a desire to portray with dignity the life of the working people among whom he had been raised as a minister's son in Pennsylvania. One of Tanner's early works, The Thankful Poor, characteristically depicts ordinary people engaged in everyday activities. The mood is one of quiet devotion, not far removed from the realism of Millet, but quite different from the emotionalism of the sculptures of Edmonia Lewis, Tanner's older contemporary. Tanner painted the grandfather, grandchild, and main objects in the room in great detail, whereas everything else dissolves into loose strokes of color and light. The lighting reinforces the painting's reverent spirit, with deep shadows intensifying the man's devout concentration. The golden rays pouring in the window illuminate the quiet expression of thanksgiving on the younger face. The deep sense of sanctity evoked here in terms of everyday experience became increasingly important for Tanner. Within a few years of completing The Thankful Poor, he began painting biblical subjects grounded in direct studies from nature and in the love of Rembrandt that had inspired him from his days as a Philadelphia art student. Edmonia Lewis is forever free. About 15 years older than Henry Ossawa Tanner, Edmonia Lewis was the daughter of a Chippewa mother and an African-American father. Born in upstate New York and given the name Wildfire, Lewis became an orphan when she was 4 years old and was raised by the Chippewa. She adopted the name Edmonia Lewis in 1859 when she was admitted to Oberlin College, the first American college to grant degrees to women and among the first to admit African Americans. After Oberlin, Lewis became an apprentice to a sculpture studio in Boston. She financed her 1865 trip to Rome, which became her permanent home, with the sale of portrait medallions and marble busts, mostly representing abolitionist leaders. Lewis Lewis's success in a field dominated by white European and American men is a testament to both her artistic skill and her determination. Her accomplishments as a sculptor also speak to the increasing access to artistic training available to women during the 19th century. Lewis produced sculptures stylistically indebted to neoclassicism, but depicting contemporary realistic themes. Forever Free is a marble statue she carved while living in Rome, surrounded by examples of both classical and Renaissance art. It represents two freed African American slaves immediately after President Lincoln's issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. The man stands triumphantly in a pose reminiscent of classical statues. His right hand rests on the shoulder of the kneeling woman, with her hands clasped in thankful prayer. The man holds aloft in his left hand a broken manacle and chain, as literal and symbolic references to his former servitude. Produced 4 years after Lincoln's proclamation Forever Free, originally titled The Morning of Liberty, was widely perceived as an abolitionist statement. Forever Free is a phrase that Lincoln used both in his preliminary September 1862 and final 1863 Emancipation Proclamations. Although emancipated, the former slaves still had shackles in contrast to those born free. However, other factors caution against an overly simplistic reading. For example, scholars have debated the degree to which the sculptor attempted to inject a statement about gender relationships into this statue, and whether the kneeling position of the woman is in reference to female subordination in the African American community. One of the results of the emancipation of the slaves in America following the Civil War is that male former slaves also gained the right to vote. It could not be until 1920, however, that women, even white women, became eligible to vote in the United States, a few years after women were permitted to vote in Canada and England. Many historians of American art, politics, and culture think that in Forever Free, Lewis was also expressing her view that although all former African slaves had been freed by Lincoln, black women remained inferior to black men. John Everett Miailles. One of the founders of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was John Everett Miailles. Miailles' Ophelia garnered enthusiastic praise when the painter exhibited it in Exposition Universelle in Paris in 1855, the exhibition at which Courbet set up his pavilion of realism. The subject from Shakespeare's Hamlet is the drowning of Ophelia, who in her madness is unaware of her plight. When down her weedy trophies and herself fell in the weeping brook, her clothes spread wide, and mermaid-like, awhile they bore her up, till that her garments, heavy with their drink, pulled the poor wretch from her melodies, lay to muddy death. To make the pathos of the scene visible, Miailles became a faithful and feeling witness of its every detail, reconstructing it with a lyricism worthy of its original poetry. Charles Baudelaire called him the poet of meticulous detail. Although the scene is fictitious and therefore one of the realist painters would have rejected, Miailles worked diligently to present it unswervingly fidelity to visual fact. He painted the background on a site at a spot along the Hogsmill River in Surrey. For the figure of Ophelia, Miailles had a friend lie in a heated bathtub full of water for hours at a time to study how a female figure would look truly laying in the body of water. Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Another founder of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who established an enviable reputation as both a painter and a poet. Like other members of the group, Rossetti focused on a literary and biblical elements in his art. He also produced numerous portraits of women that projected an image of ethereal beauty and melded apparent opposites. For example, a Victorian prettiness with a sensual allure. His Beata Beatrix is ostensibly a portrait of a literary figure. Beatrice from Dante's Vita Nuova, in Rossetti's painting, Dante's heroine overlooks Florence in a trance after being mystically transported to heaven. Yet the portrait also had personal resonance for Rossetti. It served as a memorial to his wife, Elizabeth Siddal, the model for Miais's Ophelia. Siddal had died shortly before Rossetti began his painting in 1862. In the image, a red dove, a messenger of both love and death, deposits a poppy, symbolic of sleep and death, in the hands of the seated woman, Siddal Beatrice, who has a faraway look on her face. Because Siddal died of an opium overdose, the presence of a poppy assumes greater importance and symbolism. House of Parliament. England also celebrated its medieval heritage with neo-Gothic buildings. In London, when the old Houses of Parliament burned in 1834, the Parliamentary Commission decreed that proposed designs for the new building had to be either Gothic or Elizabethan. Charles Barry, with the assistance of Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin, won the commission for the new Houses of Parliament in 1835. By this time, architectural style had become a matter of selection from the historical past. Barry had traveled widely in Europe, Greece, Turkey, Egypt, and Palestine, studying the architecture of each place. He preferred the classical Renaissance styles, but he had designed some earlier neo-Gothic buildings, and Pugin successfully introduced him in the direction of English late Gothic, a major example of which, the Chapel of Henry VII, stands directly across the street from the House of Parliament. Pugin was one of a group of English artists and critics who saw a moral purity and spiritual authenticity in the religious architecture of the Middle Ages and revered the careful medieval artisans who built the great cathedrals. The Industrial Revolution was flooding the market with cheaply made and ill-designed commodities. Machine work was replacing handicraft. Many included believed in the necessity of restoring the old artisanship, which they felt embodied honesty as well as quality. Pugin was also the author of the influential True Principles of Pointed or Christian Architecture, which Richard Upjohn consulted for his neo-Gothic Trinity Church in New York City. The design of the Houses of Parliament, however, is not genuinely Gothic. Despite its picturesque tower groupings, the clock tower, holding Big Ben at the north end, and the Victoria Tower at the south. The building has a formal axial plan and a kind of Paladin regularity beneath its neo-Gothic detail. Royal Pavilion. Although the neoclassical and neo-Gothic styles dominated early 19th century architecture, exotic new approaches of all manner soon began to appear, due in part to European imperialism and in part to the Romantic spirit permeating all the arts. Great Britain's forays throughout the world, particularly in India, had exposed English culture to a broad range of artistic traditions. The Royal Pavilion, designed by John Nash, is an eclectic mix of architectural styles. Nash was an established architect known for neoclassical buildings in London, when the Prince Regent asked him to design a royal pleasure palace in the seaside resort of Brighton. The architecture of Greece, Egypt, and China influenced in the interior decor of the Royal Pavilion, but the fantastic exterior is a conglomeration of Islamic domes, minarets, and screens that some architectural historians described as Indian Gothic. Underlying the exotic facade is a cast iron skeleton as an early, if hidden, use of this material in a non commercial construction. Nash also put this metal to fanciful use, creating large sized palm tree columns in cast iron to support the royal pavilion's kitchen ceiling. The building, an appropriate enough background for gala throngs pursuing pleasure by the seaside, had served as a prototype for countless playful architectural exaggerations still found in European and American resorts. Prefabricated architecture, completely undraped construction, that is, the erection of buildings that did not conceal their cast iron construction in structural skeletons, first became popular in conservatories or greenhouses of English country estates. An especially grandiose example is the palm house of the Royal Botanical Gardens in the London suburb of Kew, designed by Decimus Burton and Richard Turner. Joseph Paxton built in several of these structures for the Duke of Devonshire. In the largest, at Chatsworth, he used an experimental system of glass and metal roof construction. Encouraged by the success of the system, Paxton submitted a winning glass and iron building design in competition for the hall to house the 1851 Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of all nations in London. As innovative as Paxton's use of modern materials in place of stone was, his adaptation of new cost-effective ways to erect his exhibition building, the Crystal Palace. Paxton was the champion of prefabricated architecture, the use of structural elements manufactured in advance and transported to the construction site ready for assembly. In traditional stone architecture, masons carved the column capitals, moldings, and the like on site to ensure that these delicate features would not be damaged during transport. This slowed down construction considerably. Paxton's use of prefabricated parts, primarily glass planes in wood-framed and glass cast iron pillars and beams, enabled workers to build the vast 18-acre Crystal Palace in the then unheard of time of 6 months, and to dismantle it quickly at the exhibition's closing to avoid permanent obstruction of the park. The building was the perfect expression of the new industrial age that the great exhibition celebrated. Paxton's design nonetheless borrowed much from traditional architecture, especially Roman and Christian basilicas. The Crystal Palace had a central flat roof nave and a barrel-vaulted crossing, the transept providing ample interior space to contain displays of huge machines, as well as to accommodate decorative touches in the form of large working fountains and giant trees. The public admired the Crystal Palace so much that the workers who dismantled it put up an enlarged version of the Glass and Iron Exhibition Hall at a new location on the outskirts of London at Sydenham, where it remained until a fire destroyed it in 1936. Fortunately, a few old black and white photographs and several color lithographs preserve a record of the Crystal Palace's appearance.